Right, thank you for listening to my talk today. My name is Matthew Carroll and I work in the research division at Cambridge Assessment. And today I'll be speaking to you about work I've carried out over the last year, where I've been analysing the portrayal of exams in the UK print media. So to begin with, I'll give you some background to the talk. And it's been long established that the media has an important agenda-setting role in society. It can influence the public discourse, how people perceive things, what people perceive to be important. This was summed up nicely by Cohen in 1963, who said, "The media may not be successful much of the time in telling people what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about." So effectively, what the media writes about becomes important to people. It can influence how people perceive issues. And we know that education is a major focus of news coverage. So for those of us working in the education sector, I think it's important that we understand how it's portrayed in the media, because this is going to influence how the public understand the education system. And this has been of interest to researchers previously. So been analyses of media coverage on a range of education issues from a range of countries, from PISA results in Canada through to teachers' issues in the USA, through to problems in the system in Australia. And across this diverse set of analyses, some key themes have emerged. And these are that the media often focuses on problems and crises in the system. It'll simplify sometimes quite complex issues, sometimes to the point of oversimplifying them. And it can often promote a reform agenda, so saying things should change, things need to improve. And within the UK specifically, analyses have shown that there's been increasing coverage of education since the 1980s. There's been a strong focus on exams and results specifically. There's, alongside this, been a narrative of declining standards, saying that things aren't what they used to be. And it's been argued that this risks reducing trust in the whole system. Now, if we think about how these analyses have been carried out, well, most of them have used traditional content analysis methods. And this is effectively where you might come up with a framework of things that you're looking for and then apply that to a range of articles to identify particular themes, particular features, get quantitative results, or it might be constructing a longer argument and pulling examples out of your sources to support that argument. And while this gives very detailed results, it's very time intensive, and so most of the analyses have had to deal with limited sample sizes, not dealing with too many articles. And there's also an element of researcher influence there, so you have to kind of know what you're looking for before you start. And an alternative approach is provided by more recent methods, computer-based methods, generally called text mining. And these are quantitative methods that treat text as data. And the benefits of these are that it's very rapid, so you can analyse large samples, and it's a data-driven approach, so you're reducing the influence of the researcher. But while they're very useful, they do require simplification of the text. It can't deal with the complexity of the language, so you're going to lose some context, you're going to lose some subtleties. But we know that it can work for analysing media coverage of education, because these text mining methods have already been applied to media coverage of massive open online courses. And so it could be that in the big data era, text mining methods could be useful to help us understand more about the media coverage of education. And so my aim in this research was to analyse coverage of GCSEs in the UK print media. Now, for those of you not familiar with the UK education system, GCSEs are the General Certificate of Secondary Education. They are academic qualifications taken between the ages of 14 and 16 in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. They were introduced in the mid-1980s and the first final exams were sat in 1988. Since then, there have been debates around standards and whether they're being maintained. And reforms, major reforms, were announced in 2013 with the first reformed exams sat just last year. And every year results are released in August, and this is a big focus of press coverage. And so I wanted to apply text mining methods, these big data methods, to news articles about GCSEs. I wanted to identify patterns in coverage, so specifically looking for common words, looking at the sentiments expressed and trying to identify the topics that are being covered. And I wanted to examine changes in coverage over 30 years from when the GCSE was introduced to when the first reformed exams were taken. So that's the background of the research, and now I'll take you through briefly how I approached it. Well, the first step was to build a collection of news articles, and so to do this I used an online database of legal information and of news articles called Lexis Library. Now, we are a department of the University of Cambridge, so I was able to access this via the University of Cambridge Library, and I used the search tool to find articles containing the word GCSE that were published from 1988 onwards, and that were published in any national newspaper or in the Times Educational Supplement, which is a specialist education publication. And once I'd found these articles, I downloaded them as plain text so that I could analyse them in the R statistical program. And once I'd got them, I then had to filter the articles to improve the relevance, to make sure they were really about GCSEs, really about education. So I removed any duplicates. I only kept articles in news and comment sections, and I only kept articles where the word GCSE occurred at least 4 times or in the title. And this whole process was just because actually it turns out GCSEs are mentioned in a whole range of things, often not that relevant to this key question. So this process just made sure I was only analysing articles about GCSEs, about education. And I then had to clean and process the text. So I standardized some words. So words like coursework, for example, could be written with a hyphen, it could be written with a space, making sure that they're all presented in the same way, so we're not going to undercount them when we come to that. I then removed a load of junk text. So this is things called stop words, which are structural words like and, but, the, and so on. Words that are very frequently used but don't really add much meaning. I removed computer code, web addresses, and so on. Removed large numbers. Small numbers were important because GCSEs are now graded with numbers. And I removed punctuation. And I then lemmatized the words. So this is where the inflections, the word endings are removed, but the form is retained. So, for example, the verb examined would go back to its root of examine. And then everything was converted to lowercase. And this is the simplification that I mentioned earlier. We have to really strip a lot of the complex language out of there, really break things down to the simplest form so that these methods can work. So once I'd done this, I was left with nearly 7,000 articles, over 2 million words, over 34,000 unique words, and the median article length was 261 words. And if we just briefly look at the composition of this final corpus, well, this is the range of sources that were included, and we'll see that the largest sources were all broadsheets, so the Guardian, the Times, and the Independent were the 3 largest sources. If we look at the time periods published, well, the vast majority of articles were actually from the most recent 10 years. And if we look at the month of publication, most articles were from August. So when we're looking at results, bear in mind that the overall corpus is going to be mostly influenced by broadsheets, the last 10 years, and August. So do bear that in mind. And then I analysed the text using these text mining techniques. And my approach was very much guided by this textbook, so if you're interested more in these methods, do take a look at that. But I used the tidy text and topic models packages in R again. The first thing to do is look at simple word frequencies, so literally just see what the most common words were. I then carried out what we call a sentiment analysis, so this is to see what the sentiment expressed in the articles was. And to do this, I used something called the Bing lexicon. So this is effectively just a dictionary that classifies words as being positive or negative in their sentiment, and simply match words in my corpus to words in this dictionary and see what the balance is. And we found there were over 200,000 words could be classified in total, of which 3,500 were unique, so about 10% of words in the corpus. And to look at the net sentiment of an article, I just summed up all the positive words and then subtracted all of the negative words from that. So it's a very simplistic approach, and we do have to be careful. There are important caveats in such a simplistic approach. Are we really getting to the meaning in the text? Well, possibly not, but it's a very useful, quick method to indicate broad sentiment. And Then finally, I wanted to know what the topics covered were, so I carried out a process called topic modelling, and this is using a method called latent Dirichlet allocation. Don't have time to go into the details of this, but effectively it assumes that a document is a mixture of topics, and a topic is defined by a set of associated words, and it automatically generates what it thinks the topics are. And so I used this to fit 50 topics, and I manually interpreted what the topics meant by looking at the words most associated with that topic and viewing a sample of articles as well. So I judged manually what those topics meant. Once I'd done that, I could assign articles to the topics to find out what were the most common topics. And then once the articles were in there, I could also combine it with a sentiment analysis to see which topics were broadly positive and which topics were broadly negative. And so, without further ado, we'll take you through what I actually found. So, the simplest results to begin with, the most frequent words used. Well, this table shows you the top 20 most common words in the entire corpus. And I'll take you through some of the key patterns I noticed. Well, firstly, some of the words are inevitable. So these words like school, GCSE, education. This is what the corpus is about, so they're going to be heavily used. And this was quite consistent over time, all through the whole 30 years. We saw this focus on exams and results. We see words like exam, grade, percent, result. And again, this was consistent over time. So even back in the first decade of the corpus, these words were still very heavily used. One interesting pattern potentially is that there seemed to be potentially a greater focus on students rather than teachers. So pupil, student and child were all in the top 20, but the only word relating to teachers or teaching was teacher. Now, an interesting aspect of this was that over the 30 years, the word student actually increased in rank through time, but teacher decreased in rank. So it started off higher and it shifted to lower. This implies perhaps that there's been a shift in focus of coverage from talking about GCSEs through the lens of teachers to talking about them through the lens of students. So I can't prove that, but it certainly is indicated by this frequency change. And finally, an interesting element to me is that there seems to be a real focus on core subjects, traditional subjects, English and maths. There are no more subject names mentioned in the top 20 there. And again, the rank of these words increased over the 30 years. So it seems like there's increased focus on English and maths, these kind of core subjects. So that's some of the findings from the most frequent words. And then let's think about the positive and negative words used at the start of the sentiment analysis. So this is the top 20 words classified as positive. And what we see is that positive words seem to focus on performance, good performance. So good is the top word. We're also saying top, better, best. It's very focused on the top end of things. We see an element of comparing things over time, improve and progress. And we're seeing an element of celebration as well, potentially tied into this focus on exam results, achievement, success. If we think about the negative words used, well, we see the top word is fail. Now, this could be that students have failed their exams. It could be that schools are failing. The system could be failing the students. We don't know exactly what the failing corresponds to, but failure is the top negative concept there. We're also, again, seeing change over time, like fall, decline, lose. We're seeing difficulty coming in, hard, difficult, struggle. And we're seeing an element of problems with words like concern, worry, fear. So these indicate the language used in positive and negative senses. But we have to be careful here, because think about it. Would a newspaper writing about easy exams really be talking positively about them? It's hard to say. And even the word hard, that comes out as negative, but well, if it was an exam was being described as too hard, yes, that would be negative. But if it was hard new exams going to test students, maybe a newspaper would be writing about that in a positive sense. So we do have to be very careful with this sentiment analysis. It is a very broad brush approach. Now, as I say, the next step was to look at the net sentiment scores within articles, look at how many positive and negative words there were. So if we look overall, well, there were more positive words than negative words in the corpus. So 54% of the words classified were positive. And when we looked at this on a per article basis, well, actually, 58% of the articles had a positive balance of words, compared to only 37% that had a negative balance. So there were more positive articles. So this may contrast with the prior expectations of negative coverage, because breaking it down on a purely kind of word-to-word basis, there seems to be more positive words used. But again, we have to remember the caveats. We have to be very careful. This is very heavily simplified, and we can't look at the complexity of language. But at least initially, it seems like there is this slight contrast with this expectation of really negative coverage. We can also look at how sentiment changed over time. So this graph shows net sentiment on the y-axis going from positive up the top to negative down the bottom. And we've got just time on the x-axis going over the 30 years studied. And this grey line plots the smooth term I fitted to all of the articles. So each point here represents one article. And what we see is that sentiment actually started quite strongly negative, down in the late 1980s. It was down in the net negative area. It then gradually increased through the 1990s. It became more positive, and it peaked around 2000 and then started to decline gradually again, but only very gradually. A really notable thing is that there's a very sharp decline in about 2012, 2013. And it happens that this coincided with a fall in the English pass rates. So there's a lot of talk in the literature about criticism of slipping standards, grade inflation, and so on. But the biggest shift towards negative language occurred when pass rates fell, and it led to really quite intense scrutiny of the whole system. So that's an interesting kind of counterintuitive thing, perhaps. The biggest sentiment decline associated with when pass rates fell. It does rebound from that though, but while it rebounds, sentiment does end on a decline. It's shifting back towards the negative end of things. And so what this suggests is that we're not seeing this simple decline over time. I might have expected going into this that sentiment started quite positive and then gradually became negative, but that's not at all what we see. We see quite a complex change over time. Then finally, we wanted to think about the most common topics written about. So carried out this topic modelling. And so let's just think about the top 5 topics. Well, the top one was what I called result summaries. This had words like year, grade, result, percent, A star, and this peaked in August. So this is every year, results are released, and the biggest focus across the entire corpus of articles was this description of what people have got. The next most common topic was targets and results, and this had similar words, but it peaked in October and January. So this, rather than being description of the results in August, seemed to be linked to the release of school performance tables. Again, a major focus though. The next topic was called grade boundaries and marking. This had words like grade, off-call, it's a regulator, exam, English boundary, and this peaked in 2012. So this seems to be linked to that decline in sentiment I mentioned on the previous slide when English grades fell. The fourth most popular topic was about reforms. This had words like new, change, exam, reform, and system, and this peaked every time reform was actually happening or whether it was just being discussed. And finally, the fifth topic was the Gove reforms. So these are the major reforms that finally went through 2013. They were announced and we see a peak then. And so what this suggests is that perhaps as expected from what was previously known, the major topics written about were results, a potential kind of crisis in the system, and then reform. So this is certainly bearing out what we expected in advance. Just briefly to mention what I found in terms of changes over time, there did seem to be increased prominence of topics linked to results. So those results topics actually increased in their coverage over time. And there was focus on reforms throughout the 30 years, but obviously the focus of that changed over time. So at the start it was the introduction of GCSEs, and by the end it was the Gove reforms, but reform was a constant. And then finally, as I say, was able to look at the sentiment of articles within these topics. And what I found was that positive topics related to high-performing students, high-performing schools, and profiles of new initiatives that people were trying to advertise effectively. Negative topics, though, were linked to personal problems, tragedies, and then the exam system and reform. So the most negative topics were actually about the system. The most positive topics were about people. And what this suggests perhaps is that the system can be criticised. The system is criticised, it's talked about in negative terms, but the people the students, the teachers, are talked about more positively than the system. And so, just to briefly conclude, the headline findings were GCSE coverage seems to be strongly tied to the exam cycle. GCSEs seem effectively indivisible from the exams, from the results in particular. There have been subtle shifts in coverage over the 30 years, so seen an increased focus on results, on English and maths, these core subjects, and on students themselves. Positive language seems to be linked to achievement and improvement, but negative language seems to be linked to failure and decline and difficulty. Sentiment was perhaps more positive than expected initially, and it actually increased over time but then did decrease again. But the sharpest decline, interestingly, was when pass rates fell, going against expectations. And major topics covered seem to focus on results and reforms, and topics linked to students and schools were positive, but topics linked to the exam system were resoundingly negative. And so I'll just end with a few discussion points to take away, really. Firstly, I think we see a complex relationship in the way that GCSEs are written about in the press. So GCSEs are strongly associated with exams, and the whole exam system seems to be viewed negatively, but good results are viewed positively. So are we seeing a separation of people who are praised and a system which is often criticised? I think I went in expecting to see concerns about declining standards, but the biggest sentiment decline was associated with a fall in pass rates, so going against what I expected. So I wonder, would making the system clearer to the public help to build confidence in it, so that when these perhaps unexpected things happen, it doesn't immediately make them think that something's gone wrong? And reforms have almost always been a key part of coverage for the whole 30 years since GCSEs were introduced. Now, I wonder, how does this affect public perception? GCSEs always being written about in terms of whether they are working, whether we should scrap them, whether we should change them. I wonder how that affects public perception. And the final point I want to make really is that this is a backwards looking analysis, looking back at the 30 years that have just been. But the impacts of recent reforms are yet to be seen. But what we can say is that using text mining, using big data methods, we're in a better position than ever to be able to quickly and fairly easily monitor coverage of education and exams so that we can better understand the public perception of them. So with that, I thank you very much for listening.